Hey class, welcome to this lecture. Today we are going to be talking about Reconstruction. Reconstruction is the period immediately following the American Civil War. Let's start today by looking at this photograph. When you look at this, what words would you use to describe it? What emotions does this bring out in you? Maybe dreary. It is black and white, but dark, dismal. Really is a hollowed out building, the debris of a building, multiple stories. Kind of depressing. I'm certainly glad that I don't live here. When do you think this photograph was taken? And where do you think this was taken? It reminds me of a war-torn, like post-World War I. Maybe France, maybe Germany, World War II era. I know, given that we're talking about the Civil War and Reconstruction, I'm guessing a bad guess wouldn't it be right around that time point. In terms of location, this is Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. This is April 1865. This is right at the end of the war, right when the Confederate States have surrendered to General Grant and the Union armies. When you look at this picture, what are some things that you think about the people who live here, or who had lived here? And certainly this would be a challenging time if you lived in this. This was your building. How would you feel about the people who did this to you? How would you feel about the cause that you followed that resulted in this? Look, today, in talking about Reconstruction, we're largely looking at it from a psychological perspective. Of course, we'll be looking at some of the hands-on events that took place, but largely I want you to try to wrap your mind around the emotions of people from both sides. What would it feel like to end a bloody war for 4 years and then try to come back together? This is especially pertinent, I think, to America in 2020, 2021, when I know politically our nation certainly feels divided. There's been a lot of direct and heated language thrown at candidates on either side of the aisle, and the people who support candidates on either side of the aisle. In a way, there's been this war of words and war of policy. Some have even called for civil war. Some have called for a breaking off of states. At the end of this, how would it be possible for red and blue America to come back together? I mean, there's a lot of parallels here, I think. So, just to recap, the American Civil War was fought between 1861 and 1865. At the heart of the Civil War was the issue of slavery, especially disagreements about slavery and where slavery could continue, and what the role of government was, of federal government, in establishing laws either for or against slavery. And these disagreements led to sectional lines. Many white Southerners, both those who held slaves and those who didn't, supported slavery, while many Northerners opposed slavery. And in the end, after 4 years of battles, the United States defeated the Confederate States of America. So, after the Civil War ended, the United States will enter into a period that's often referred to as Reconstruction. If you think about this term, to construct, again, reconstruct, what's being constructed? Well, of course, it's the war-torn United States of America. It is not just the cities, it's not just the infrastructure, the roads, the railroads, but it's also the relationship between North and South, relationship between black and white. So Reconstruction era is the period between 1865 And we often refer to 1877 as the end of Reconstruction. So roughly a 12-year period. Now, Lincoln will have just won a re-election campaign. It was not a given. He ran against one of his generals, who was it? Can't remember. Anyways, Lincoln will run. He will win re-election. Remember, the South does not vote for him. The Confederate States are withdrawn from the Union. They do not cast votes either for or against Lincoln. It's largely the votes of the northern states, the Union states, many people have grown tired of war, have grown tired of the casualties, of the bad news. And but ultimately, Lincoln will win re-election. He will be assassinated shortly after the war will end. He is replaced by his vice president, a man named Andrew Johnson from Tennessee. He was a senator from Tennessee. He was also a Southern Democrat. And this time, Democrats were the party of slavery. And so Johnson was a Southerner. He was from Tennessee, a slaveholding state, who fought against the Union. And he was not a secessionist. He did not support the cause of the Civil War. He did not want his people to break free. But he was most definitely not a Unionist. He was opposed to Confederacy, but he wasn't as sympathetic to the northern states as Lincoln and other northern Republicans were. Now, after Lincoln's assassination, after Johnson becomes the 17th president of the United States, many people in Congress were opposed to Johnson. Now, think about it. This was a war. If we look at it on political lines, the North was largely controlled by a voting bloc of Republicans who were in favor of abolition, and the South was largely controlled by Democrats who were in favor of slavery. And now, after 4 long years, Lincoln is now dead, and the man who has taken on the reins of the nation, the one who is responsible for rebuilding himself, he is a Southerner. Right? He's a Southerner. He is representing the states that lost, the people that lost. He is the one who is controlling the direction the country will go. And for that reason, many people in Congress who are predominantly Republicans oppose Johnson. Now, the most radical wing of the Republican Party, a group that we will call radical Republicans, these were the most extreme group of that political party. They wanted to see extreme changes to society. And in the 1860s, the radical Republicans wanted to punish the South for the Civil War. And they supported equal rights for the freedmen, for those men and women who've been freed from slavery. Just a second. Let me pause this and take care of this baby. All right, let's see how this works. Okay, so, sorry for that. So we're at this point. How should we bring everything back together? Imagine it, if those of you with children, imagine your child has done something really wrong. They come back, maybe they broke a window in a car, maybe they snuck out at night and you're catching them. I'm sure a part of you would want to be understanding and sympathetic, but wouldn't a part of you also really want to give it to them, ground them, really make them suffer, let them know how much, pain and turmoil they caused you? Now, imagine this is a war. Over 750,000 people will die. Imagine you being a Northerner, looking at that Southerner, looking at the destruction that they caused, the years of heartache, right? Maybe the loss of a husband or a father. All of this, in their opinion, all of this really unnecessary work, or unnecessary labor, unnecessary loss. And now the war is over, and considering how to bring things back together, the president says, it's fine. Let's just let them back in. no harm done. Let's just pretend that nothing happened. Well, that wasn't going to slide. The radical Republicans did not like this type of plan. They really wanted to make sure the South suffered. They wanted to penalize the Confederate generals, to make it so that they could never rejoin the Union. They wanted to penalize the governmental leaders of the South, to make sure they could never vote or hold office again. They wanted people to suffer. But does that bring healing? Does that bridge the gap between North and South? Does it do it quickly? Lincoln recognized that would not happen. So here are some major questions that are at the heart of what the country is grappling with in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War in the first 2 years of Reconstruction. Questions about how should the South be rebuilt, and who should be responsible for paying for it? How should the states that seceded be brought back into the Union? Should the North just open up their arms? Welcome back, my prodigal son. Thanks for coming back. All your sins, all your mistakes have been forgiven. How should former slaves be incorporated into the country as freed men and women? Should they be given the same rights, the same access before the law, the same representation, the same opportunities for political involvement and engagement? Questions continue. Maybe. If my slides move. Here we go. After 4 years of war and over 200 years of slavery, could Northerners and Southerners rebuild the South together? Could they unify as citizens of the same country, given just how different their trajectories had been, how different their economies, their labor force had been, their values had been? But other questions were raised about the consequences and what consequences there would be for the Confederate States. Should those people who fought against the United States be recognized as citizens? Should they be punished? Should they be fined? Should they be forced to rebuild the northern towns and roads? Should they ever be allowed to vote again? Should they ever be allowed to hold political office? What should be done to the southern state governments that fought against the United States? And again, looking at this from the perspective of these freed men and women, just before the Civil War, there were about 4 million enslaved people in the United States. And for over 200 years, black people in America had been systematically dehumanized. As slaves, they were considered property, and as such, they had no legal rights. Consider, for instance, the Dred Scott decision of 1857, when Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote for the majority that slaves, that African Americans, that black Americans had no rights that white men or white people were forced to abide by or respect. Right? That is the place of African Americans, of slaves prior to the start of the Civil War. That they had no rights. In America, they had no rights. They were certainly not citizens. They did not have access before the law. They did not have representation. But with the end of slavery, what would be the place of black Americans, of this group that we will call freedmen and freedwomen? During the Civil War, African Americans provided critical support to the Union's fight. They acted as spies, as cooks, as soldiers, as laundriers for the army. Black soldiers made up just about 10% of the Union Army, half of whom were free Northerners, and the other half were Southerners who escaped to Union lines. And this group were often assigned the hardest, most dangerous tasks, and they usually suffered far worse than white soldiers when taken prisoners by the Confederate Army. So questions about how would freed men and women be treated in the southern states or in the northern states? How would Northerners address the issues of including former slaves as citizens in society? And what were some of the major challenges that the former slaves faced? All of these questions abide, or they exist. And while we will not be able to answer all of them, I want you to again, in your mind, consider the psychological impact of these questions, of bridging two polar opposite spectrums of the American society, two groups who had warred against each other for 4 years and had more or less terrorized each other for the previous 30 years. How can we bring these two together? And so, for our purposes today, the central historical question that we're going to be engaging with, investigating, is this one. Why was the radical Republican plan for Reconstruction considered radical?